Hey guys, it's Miss C. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms, which is crazy because somehow we've managed to classify everything we know that is considered living into two extremely broad categories. We got prokaryote over here. This little picture is just a general prokaryotic organism. Prokaryotes, we can divide those into two categories, that being you got your domain bacteria and you got your domain archaea. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we actually get into classifying organisms, but it's something that's nice to know for now. Prokaryotic organisms are divided into those two domains, whereas the third domain is eukarya, which hosts all of the eukaryotic organisms that we are aware of. And those kingdoms underneath eukarya are going to be animal, us, our plant friends, fungi and mushrooms and all that. And then there's another one called protista, which is a little less mainstream of a kingdom. We don't hear about it as much, but it doesn't mean it's not important. In this video, I'm going to really get into the differences structurally between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. When it comes to actual function of these cells, we'll get into that more and more throughout the year and talk more about that. So right now, we're just going to start with what makes something alive. What do these prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells have in common? Boom. You got your, I qualify as life form starter pack here. So I've kind of picked out some major structural components that you're going to see across all taxa. You're going to see them in prokaryotes, eukaryotes. They're what you really need to be considered a living thing, and a living organism. So here in the top left, we got our very nice DNA strand. All right. So right now I'm just listing off things that these organisms have in common. You got to have DNA. That's basically the instruction manual for what you are, whether you're a simple prokaryote, a bacteria, strep, for instance. It's going to have DNA that codes for its proteins. Plants, animals, fungi, anything you could think of that we consider alive, you have to have DNA. There's no getting around it. Without the instructions for who and what you are, there is no you. And again, kind of moving on that, we have number 2, we got our ribosomes. If you have DNA, that's fantastic, but if you have no way of transcribing and translating that DNA to something real, at this point, you're just DNA in a vial of solution. You know, you're not able to construct yourself and make those instructions written in your DNA something actually legitimate. So you got to have ribosomes. Ribosomes are organelles that are in charge of reading RNA and turning that into proteins. And that goes with the whole central dogma idea of DNA to RNA to protein. You have to have ribosomes. They are the protein factories. You can think of them as the construction workers that are reading the blueprints and building something. Either way, you have to know that prokaryotes have these, and so do eukaryotic organisms. Everything alive is going to have ribosomes, and that's where you get into the whole thing where people might argue that viruses are living or non-living, but they actually don't have ribosomes, which is where some people might use that as a piece of evidence against viruses being considered alive. So in my definition, I'm rolling out right now, ribosomes are something that you got to have. 3, that's a really crappy picture of the cell membrane. You got to have something that separates the outside of yourself from the inside. So as a prokaryote, that's a big deal. They're literally most of the time unicellular organisms. So you have to have a cell membrane that's separating your DNA, your ribosomes, everything that makes you, you. You got to separate that from the outside environment. because without the cell membrane, in that case, you're just a bunch of crap floating around, not really organized in any way. So one thing I'll make a little note of here is, in addition to cell membranes, prokaryotic organisms typically also have cell walls. So prokaryotes have cell walls, and I'll kind of make a little note. So, because some people don't realize that they have cell walls. That's something they actually have in common with plants and not us. So just know that they do have a cell membrane and a cell wall. And couldn't really think of a better picture, but we got some sick kicks over there. So number 4, what I'm saying is also a part of the starter pack, is going to be having some way of getting around. Mobility is huge. This one's a little less important, but I do want to point out that one thing that prokaryotic organisms and eukaryotic have in common is they can have flagella and cilia, these little hair-like organelles that are going to allow your cell to move around. So you can see here on the back slide that you got this prokaryote has a nice flagellum that's going to allow it to swim through and move around in its environment, depending on what it is. All right, now that we have a gist of what makes something alive, what do I need to have to be considered living, let's get into Prokaryote 101, just going through the basics of what makes a prokaryote, or what doesn't make it a eukaryote. So on this side of, I guess, a chart you could make if you want to compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms, we're going to say, kind of rolling out, the word prokaryotic itself means pre-nucleus, so these do not have a nucleus or any what we would consider true organelles. So no membrane-bound organelles are going to be found in the prokaryote. So no nucleus or any membrane-bound organelles. All right, they don't have those. They do have DNA, right, in a nucleoid region, which is basically kind of this middle area where they're one giant chromosomes just kind of chilling out in the middle. It condenses down, and we call that region the nucleoid region. Another thing I would like to point out is, in addition to their giant chromosomes, sometimes bacteria will have tiny little circular pieces of DNA called plasmids, which we can actually manipulate with biotechnology and use that to transform bacteria from one to another, or we can make a little bacteria glow by inserting fluorescent jellyfish DNA into it, which is pretty cool, and we're actually going to do that lab later in the year. So I will say that they have plasmids, they have ribosomes, and they tend to be much smaller than eukaryotic cells, which to me makes sense. They don't have as much floating around in there. There's not as much going on. So physically smaller than our eukaryotic comparison. And I know I have like this picture here with the nasty strep throat looking doctor's visit. And the reason for that is because when you go to the doctor and you're like, oh, I think I might have strep throat, and the doctor's going to stick a nice little swab right where you're saying your body hurts the most at that point in time. They're going to swab around, it's uncomfortable, and then they're going to send that swab to a lab. And in that lab, they're going to do what's called a culture on it. And the reason why it works, the reason why they can spread your nasty throat germs on a agar plate, stick it in a warm environment overnight, they do that because bacteria actually can divide using something called binary fission. That's different than eukaryotic organisms. We use mitosis and meiosis. They actually divide with binary fission, which is asexual. Okay, they don't need to mate, okay? They do not need to mate to have to grow and make colonies. So when the doctor takes that swab, they rub it on the auger plate, they let it sit. Then they'll analyze the various cultures and colonies that grow and see if you actually have strep or maybe it's allergies or something else. So, and this is pretty much a rundown of things that are unique slash what makes up a prokaryotic organism. So no nucleus, DNA is in a nucleoid region, they got plasmids, they have ribosomes, they're small, and they divide using binary fission. So moving on to last but not least, we got Eukaryote 101. Eukaryotic organisms are going to actually have a nucleus. So go us, we're compartmentalized, we're complex, we have nuclei. So cells have a nucleus. We have an array of these beautiful organelles that each have its own unique function. Everything's super organized and has its own compartments, its own job. So what it allows is for your cells to specialize. Your brain cell is not going to be the same as your kidney cell when you look at it under a microscope. So we have organelles. I'm just going to put, DNA's in the nucleus. We got ribosomes as well. And we actually can compare and contrast your plant and animal cells. They're a little bit different, right? Plants have a cell wall. They got chloroplasts to undergo photosynthesis and things like that. So we have nucleus, organelles, ribosome. The organelle thing is huge. And then we can do a little plants versus animal. Plants have cell wall, which is actually similar to prokaryotes in that regard. Animal cells do not. They have chloroplast and a big old central vacuole where they're going to swell up with water, keep the whole thing hydrated. Animal cells are going to have these things called centrioles, which are used in dividing. They're going to have Animal cells are also going to have our cilia and flagella, which we can use to move about. Kind of adding to the list up here, I would like to say that eukaryotic cells in general are larger, and also they use mitosis and meiosis to divide their cells. Mitosis is going to be for somatic body cells, kidney, heart, liver, brain, whatever, and meiosis is used exclusively for gamete formation, so making egg and sperm. Yes, plants do undergo sexual reproduction. They release pollen, and that is going to fertilize other plants around. People sometimes assume that plants are asexual just because I feel like they don't move around, but they actually do undergo meiosis to make their own versions of egg and sperm, different than us. Obviously, animals are going to reproduce sexually different in a more conventional sense, whereas plants are just going to release their little spores into the air. So just be aware, that's a misconception I see sometimes. So just be careful that eukaryotes are going to divide sexually most of the time, plants, animals, fungi, protists, and things like that. So that was a rundown of the differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells.